Dimly lit neon signs flicker in the rain-soaked alley, casting an eerie glow on a small, strange shop with a simple sign that has foreign symbols on it and the words Dark Decibels. A tall vendor inside the shop, slightly hunched, with dark brown eyes, one just slightly smaller than the other, leans against an empty makeshift case. The hum of distant machinery echoes in the background, setting an almost ominous tone. The vendor, with a twisted smile, leans forward to welcome you in from the rain. Welcome, urban wanderer, to the twisted nexus where shadows dance to the rhythm of clandestine tales. Behold, the gateway to a realm where the neon pulse of the city intertwines with the chilling cadence of suspense. Mysteries that reverberate through the circuits of your mind. Dark Decibels whisper secrets you never knew existed, in a language only the night truly comprehends. Take a leap into the abyss, dear wanderer, where the boundary between man and machine blurs, and the echoes of thrill resonate through the veins of our reality. The vendor nods his head over to the empty makeshift case, as if beckoning you to reach for something that isn't there. You hesitantly look between him and the case, until you slowly reach your hand out to one of the shelves. Cemetery officially closed sundown to sunup. Violators will be prosecuted. The rusted sign hung askew on the wire fencing in front of the graveyard. Its letters were the color of old blood. Arnold stared at the sign but wasn't really reading it. His thoughts were a million miles away. Jen and Alice were already inside reading epitaphs. Peak Cemetery was a small graveyard and very isolated. It sat atop Horseman Hill, completely surrounded by the trees that covered the entirety of the hill. It was the last remaining vestige of what had been the town of Cold Creek back in the early 1800s, and was the subject of many local ghost stories and strange tales. Most of the stones were old and leaning with vines that crawled up them like snakes. Others were broken or fallen over completely, toppled by time, or in some cases, teenagers with nothing better to do. Arnold never liked it. It was Greg's idea to come. "Are you coming, Arnie?" Greg asked his younger brother as he lifted the latch on the cemetery gate. "Are you sure we won't get caught up here? I mean, I hear the police patrol this area pretty often." Arnold followed his brother through the gate. "This again? Come on. Now, I told you 100 times, cops aren't going to drive all the way up here every night. It's too far out of the way. They might come up here around Halloween or on the weekends, but that's about it." "I guess," Arnold said. "We're here to spook the girls," Greg whispered. His voice had the cadence of annoyance. "Do you think we can do that in broad daylight?" I guess not." Arnold didn't say much more as he followed his brother through the graveyard, who was now working his way toward the girls. He didn't bring up how the sign that hung on that fence was less than 5 years old. He didn't mention how he heard that the sign was placed there after somebody discovered a dead dog under the big tree in the middle of the graveyard, how it was reported to have been circled by black candles burned down to stubs, and how the dog was drained of its blood. Arnold looked across the graveyard to the big tree. It was ugly and gnarled, and something about it made his blood run cold. Its bark appeared black in the now dying light. Arnold had guessed that by its size, its vast network of unseen roots undoubtedly trespassed and violated the many coffins underfoot, sucking what nutrients it could from the dead, like some unholy ghost. They walked over to Jen and Alice, who were examining a headstone that had turned a sickly yellow-green with lichen. Greg lit a cigarette and stared down at the stone, saying nothing at first as he inhaled the burning smoke. "This one's pretty old," Jen said. "It's hard to read, but it looks like he died in 1845. That means he was only 23. "That's right," Greg said. Trevor Kirkwood. He read the name aloud and ashed his cigarette, then said, "Weird story, that one." Arnold wasn't saying anything at all. He wasn't even paying attention to what his brother was telling Jen and Alice. He just stood quietly, with his hands in his pockets, staring at that big, ugly tree which was less than 10 yards from where they stood and up a small incline. If people did practice occult activity up here, he could clearly understand how that would serve as some sick idol. He felt as though the tree was staring back at the four of them as intently as he stared at it. He broke his gaze and looked at his watch. 7:42. What remained of daylight would soon pass. Arnold's stomach knotted and his body quivered. He wanted to leave. Hell, he didn't want to come here in the first place. It was stupid. It was senseless. If Greg wanted to scare the girls, why not just show them a scary movie or something from the comforts and, more importantly, the safety of home? Arnold was suddenly aware Greg had said something to him. What?" he asked, his voice distant. "I said, do you remember the story of Trevor Kirkwood?" No, not really," Arnold said. It wasn't hard for him to notice the annoyed glance Greg shot him. It had been a while since I heard that one," he said, hoping this excuse would appease his brother. It seemed to. Greg began to weave his tale, and Arnold once again zoned out. He didn't even notice it as Alice moved in closer to him while Greg embellished upon the story. Arnold's attention was on the growing darkness that began to surround them and the wretched place in which they stood. It seemed as though the darkness spread out from that tree, rather than the sunless sky. He wasn't sure how long Greg had been telling the made-up story of a man whom neither of them had ever heard of, but he felt the contents of his stomach freeze into blocks of ice when he saw his brother point in the direction of the tree using the two fingers he held his cigarette with. "That's where they found it," Greg said. "It was the only trace of him." "Found what?" Alice asked. "His face," Greg said. His expression was serious, not giving away a trace of deception. It was nailed to that tree, with its mouth opened in a silent scream. The 3 nails were hammered in all the way down to their heads. They say that on a full moon night, like tonight, if you put your hands on the trunk of the tree where it had been nailed, you can feel the cold, dead flesh of Trevor Kirkwood's face. One of the girls let out a light gasp. Arnold couldn't tell which of them did this. He didn't much care at this point, he just wanted to leave. "Let's find out if the story is true," Greg said with a smile. "Greg, I think we should probably just go. Let's do some country cruising or something else instead." "Would you stop it, Arnie? What's your problem? Why do you have to be such a wet blanket all of the time, huh?" Greg's frustration at his younger brother was very real, and his reproof of him caused a palpable feeling of awkwardness that hung in the air like cold, damp fog. Alice cleared her throat and looked Arnold in the eyes. "Come on, Arnie." It was her first time calling him that. "Don't let me go up there without you." She smiled at him and took his hand. This was only his second date with Alice, but he liked her for a long time and didn't want an irrational fear to ruin any chance he might have had with her. Arnold nodded. It was all he could do. His tongue felt as though it was turned to sandpaper in his mouth. Greg stared at him as he took another drag from his cigarette. The end of it illuminated his face, and Arnold thought it made his brother's eyes appear to glow red in the dark. "Let's get it over with then," he finally managed to say, and the 4 of them started up a small hill toward the tree. Arnold didn't let go of Alice's hand, and as they drew nearer to the tree, his grip tightened. He didn't know what the hell he was so afraid of. After all, the story he heard about that damn dog probably wasn't any more true than Greg's yarn about Kirkwood's face nailed to the tree. But it wasn't what he had heard about the dog that bothered him, was it? It was the feeling that he had since they got out of the car. The feeling that they weren't alone, despite there being no evidence of another living soul. It was the feeling of being watched, even then in the gloom of late dusk. And it was that tree. Something cruel looking about it, something almost evil. A new thought entered his mind. one that filled him with existential dread. What if all the stories were true? What if somehow that tree could speak through silent whispers in the night air about all the horrible things that have happened to those buried there, those it has fed on, and the things sacrificed to it, like radio waves in the air? At this thought, Arnold's legs started to feel like foam rubber, ready to collapse under the weight of his upper body. "Can you still see the nails?" he heard Jen ask his brother. "No. It happened so long ago that the tree grew around them, I imagine," Greg answered. The quartet reached the tree. What remained of daylight had now fully passed away, and thick, gloomy clouds buried the moon in a shallow grave. The four of them just stood there quietly for a few moments until Jen asked, "Where was it hung?" "I'm not too sure," Greg answered. "Let's each take a side." Arnold wanted to protest again, but knew it would be no good. He let go of Alice's hand as she positioned herself on the north side of the tree. Meanwhile, Greg moved around the back of the tree on the east side, and Jen was on the south, opposite Alice. Arnold didn't move any closer. His mind was swimming, no, drowning in thoughts of animal sacrifice, faceless horrors, and other terrors he didn't know his imagination was capable of conjuring. "You're being silly," he thought to himself. "Just go up to the tree, touch the damn thing, and let Greg yell boo or whatever the hell he has planned on his end." "Let's reach out and touch the tree at the same time. We'll do it on the count of 3, Greg said. He flicked his cigarette away and cleared his throat. 1. Both of the girls emitted a nervous kind of giggle as they held up their hands in preparation to touch the bole of the tree. Arnold trembled, and though he felt frozen to the core, beads of sweat formed on his brow. 2. Arnold thought he heard something from behind him. It sounded like the cemetery gate squeaking open. That's when he saw Alice and Jen turn their heads in the direction in which he heard the sound. "Did you guys hear something?" Alice asked in a hushed whisper. "I did." Arnold wasted no time in answering her. "Me too," said Jen. Even Greg called out into the dark. "Hello? Is somebody there?" Silence was the only answer. "It was probably just a squirrel or something running along the fence," he said after a few moments of uncomfortable quiet. Arnold knew his brother well enough to infer that he wasn't fully convinced of his nocturnal squirrel excuse. And although neither Jen nor Alice heard it, Arnold recognized an uneasy tone in Greg's voice. He looked over his shoulder but could only see the black shadowy shapes of headstones and scraggly yucca bushes. He looked back at Alice, who too was staring off in the direction they heard the sound. "Okay, on the count of 3. Greg's voice sounded again from behind the vile tree. 1, 2, 3. At 7:23 a.m. the following morning, a pickup hauling a flatbed trailer filled with lawn care equipment headed up the north side of Horseman Hill over its only road. John Fogerty belted out the lyrics to Tombstone Shadow from the truck radio. The driver reached over and opened the igloo cooler in the passenger side seat, grabbing a can of Stag from within. He cracked open his breakfast with one hand and used the other to turn off onto the gravel lane that led up and back to the cemetery. Halfway down the lane, where it now sloped back downward, he could see a small 4-door sedan parked in front of the gate. Early morning visitors were uncommon, but not unheard of, so the driver thought little of it. He reached the end of the lane, let the song on the radio finish playing, and guzzled the remainder of his beer before he stepped out. He crushed the can and tossed it into the bed of his truck with the many others. The grass was too wet to start mowing, so he pulled his trimmer from the flatbed and got to work weeding the edges. He didn't think much about not seeing whoever owned that car, and he had been working for a half an hour before he caught sight of the tree. What was he looking at? At first, his mind couldn't process what he was seeing. And then the sudden realization of what he saw accosted him. His stomach flip-flopped, his legs gave way, and he fell backward. His head narrowly missed a marble slab. There, staring at him through eyeless sockets, he saw 4 bloody faces sliced thin as bacon and nailed to that awful tree. Thank you for listening. And if you have a short horror, sci-fi, or cyberpunk story you'd like read, share it with me through my email, mindmindpod@gmail.com.